I'm thinking of something that we all need. We can't live without it. In fact, we're expected to exercise it every day. Many find this subject a bit confusing and rather challenging. I'm referring to this thing called faith. This concept gets little attention in our modern world, and sadly, the world's understanding is rather shallow. Keep the faith, that's about as far as they go. Keep the faith. What's that mean? Keep the faith. Because a lot of people were shouting that this past week in the parade with the Celtics and the duck boats. And it all goes together beautifully. Keep the faith. But it shouldn't surprise you when I say that the subject of faith looms large and lively in the Bible. Now, the fact that you showed up this morning tells me that you know a bit about faith and that you want your faith to grow, right? Yeah. And you probably have discovered this process of growing strong faith can be a bit elusive, shall we say. What is this thing called faith anyway? And just as important, how can I nurture faith in my life? Here's an old story worth repeating. Early one morning, Chicken and Pig were walking together on the city sidewalk. They passed a restaurant. Chicken suggests they stop for breakfast. Pig, of course, agrees. They seated, take the menus. After a brief moment, Chicken announces, "Bacon and eggs over easy." "What about you, Pig? Join me?" "Bacon and eggs?" Pig asks cautiously. "Yeah, sure," responds Chicken. Pig orders organic orange juice and oatmeal. "No bacon and eggs for me." "Why?" asks Chicken. "Think about it," Pig responds. "Bacon and eggs for you is token involvement. Bacon and eggs for me is total commitment." We all wrestle with this vital difference every day, sometimes every moment. Token involvement, total commitment. This morning, I want to encourage those of you who want to grow and deepen stronger your faith in God. You've not satisfied with token involvement. You've discovered how necessary a mature faith is in a world like ours. You know how vulnerable we are. You discovered this world demands strong faith. You know that integrity on the job, healthy marriages, confident parenting, grandparenting requires strength and dependability and perseverance, and you know it all rests on one's faith. This is not news to you. Let me read something again about a man who thought he was retired. Genesis 15, just 6 verses. "After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward.' But Abram said, 'O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus.' And Abram said, 'You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.' Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir.' He took him outside and said, 'Look up at the heavens, count the stars, if indeed you can count them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. Now, our text this morning gives us help just when we need it. The Bible is our source book when it comes to strengthening our faith in God. Your faith doesn't stand a chance if you neglect the Bible's help. Let me repeat that. Your faith doesn't stand a chance if you neglect the Bible's help. If you show little interest in the Bible, you're not serious about your faith. Today's text is a play in 4 acts. Number 1, Acts chapter 1. God begins with a promise to Abraham, a promise of protection and blessing. I am your shield and your very great reward. God speaks to Abram's fears and Abram's future. Is that where you live? Your fears and your future? Me too. Act 1, God promises, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and I will protect you and fill your life and make it a blessing to others. Act 2, Abram has misgivings, of course. O sovereign Lord, he begins. That's a good start. O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? You have given me no children. Now he's harking back to chapter 12, where there's a promise that he will become the father of all nations. That was 10 years. He was 75. Now he's almost 100. He's been waiting around for 25 years. Oh God, how in the world can you promise, your promise of a future filled with blessing, even be realized in me? One who was old and getting older. One is barren of hope, to say nothing of my wife, Sarai, who was also barren. Act 3. God reassures Abram. Isn't it wonderful that God comes back more than once? Now notice, God doesn't tell Abram how any of this will occur. In the long run, it doesn't matter. It's really not important. The Lord paints Abraham a reassuring picture of his future, a future with a family as numerous as the stars of heaven. And isn't it interesting that the promise of protection and blessing come to Abram at night? Is that when you need reassurance the most? When I put my head on my pillow, my fears can grow. Finally, Act 4, best of all. Abram believed the Lord, and God credited it to him as righteous. I'm amazed that we don't know anything more than that. He just said he believed God, and God credited it to righteousness. How did that all happen? I wish there was more, but there isn't more. Now, don't miss this, friends. How was Abram deemed righteous? Because of his goodness, or his faithfulness, or his stewardship? No, 1,000 times no. Abram was deemed righteous by God because Abram believed the Lord. Have we all agreed that this is the first and most important thing we must do? We're called to believe. Believe in the Lord, not in ourselves. That calls for 2 things on our part. We must obey the truth of God we do know now, and trust the truth of God where we don't know yet. All of life calls for these 2 steps. Obey when things are clear, and trust when they're not. Obey, trust, and obey, and trust. and obey. Here in the first chapter of the 15th chapter of the first book of the Bible, we receive a clear pattern in 4 acts. God promises, we have misgivings, God reassures, we trust and obey and are deemed righteous in the process. It's the start, the secret of life. Pick any person you want in the Bible. Abram, Moses, Jeremiah, Gideon, Jonah, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Peter, Martin Luther, you, me. God promises to bless and protect. We respond with misgivings. God reassures us. Now, in our case, we might respond with more misgivings. And God will reassure us again. That God reassures us. And finally, we trust and obey and are deemed righteous. Now, if all this sounds so simple, why do we stumble? Well, it's because God, the promiser, is different from us, very different. So different that God's ways are beyond our wildest dreams. Don't try to figure out God's actions. You'll get a headache. Abram, you and Sarai are going to have a son, even though you're 100 and your wife is 90. Figure that out. Learning to trust and obey is a high challenge. It involves unwavering faith in the content of the promise and wide latitude as to the form of the fulfillment. It's being certain that God will keep his promises, but being uncertain as to know how or when or by what means. We obey God's promises and trust God for the details. Now, I'm sure, aren't you, that Abram had to give this thing called faith quite a bit of thought. That's what we don't read in the Bible. It was not token involvement for him. It was total commitment. God's promise called on Abram to act, to bet the whole of his life, so to speak, on the reliability of God's words. That's never easy. Our tendency is to set limits on God's promises, limits according to our experience and our perceptions and our understandings. That's the human thing to do. Even though our intelligence and experience are so limited. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13, we see through a glass darkly. Yet we limit God again and again. We embrace a shaky conclusion about certain situations. But God gave his promise of a son and then waited 25 years to fulfill it. I wonder, have you already concluded about your life or the life of your children or about your marriage or about your job or about this church? Or about the future of our country? Is your future dominated by your intelligence, perception, and experience? Or is your future open to the promises of the promises of protection and blessing? Having faith in God is making room for hope and wonder and for the unexpected. It all comes down to this. What do you really want out of life? What do you really want from God? Do you really admit how much you need his rescue? Do you really value his forgiveness? Do you care to be transformed? You care about the condition of your heart? Do you have any interest in being holy as he is holy? Let me conclude with this little story. Back in 1886, D.L. Moody was preaching in Brockton, Massachusetts. Daniel Toner was leading the music. That night, something special happened. Listen as Toner wrote about it. Mr. Moody was conducting a series of meetings in Brockton, and I had the pleasure of singing for him there. And one night, a young man rose in the testimony meeting and said, "I'm not quite sure about my faith, but I'm going to trust anyway, and I'm going to obey." I just jotted that sentence down and sent it to this little story to Reverend John H. Hammis, a Presbyterian minister who wrote a poem. I wrote the tune. Moody once gave this formula for successful Christian living. The blood alone makes us safe. The word alone makes us sure. And obedience alone makes us fulfilled. It's number 376. Turn to 376.